Look, I'm just saying, humans don't know what they're doing out here, Arona said, her voice carrying a blend of curiosity and bemusement. She leaned against a polished railing on the observation deck of the interstellar trade station, her long, patterned Zarin coat trailing behind her. She turned toward her companion, a human engineer named Luke, who had been tasked with assisting her during her visit. Maybe, Luke replied, his tone neutral. He adjusted the cuff of his simple gray uniform, fidgeting under Arona's intense gaze. But we're catching on fast. We wouldn't have made it this far if we weren't capable. You've made it this far because we allowed it. Arona's smile was sharp. She was taller than Luke by at least a head, her presence commanding. You've been clever, I'll give you that. But when it comes to actual spacefaring experience, you're still just, what's the word? Infants. Luke crossed his arms, trying not to let her taunts get under his skin. Maybe so, but we don't stay infants for long. We learn, adapt, do things differently. That's how we got here. Arona tilted her head, studying him. So you say, prove it, then. Prove what? That you're more than clever children playing with technology you barely understand. Luke sighed, already regretting agreeing to this assignment. He had been called up from his usual maintenance work because of his reputation for thinking on his feet. Now, he found himself sparring verbally with a Zarin ambassador who clearly loved pushing buttons, figuratively, and maybe literally, too. I'm just here to help you, he said. What exactly do you want me to prove? I'll know it when I see it. Her nonchalant answer wasn't what he wanted to hear, but he couldn't help but feel intrigued. Most aliens he had encountered on the station were either dismissive of humans or cautiously polite. Arona, on the other hand, seemed genuinely interested, though her interest felt more like someone sizing up an opponent than appreciating a potential ally. Fine, Luke said. But if we're going to be working together, I need to know what you're actually looking for. I'm looking for someone who can surprise me, Arona replied, stepping closer. Her voice lowered slightly, making Luke feel as if he were part of a secret. And you seem almost promising. He couldn't decide if that was a compliment or an insult. I'll try not to disappoint. Good. Her sharp smile returned. Because the Zarin have little patience for mediocrity. They walked down the observation deck, Luke taking a moment to glance out at the vast expanse of stars and distant planets. The station was humanity's first real foothold in this quadrant of space. And while it was impressive, it was also humbling. He knew Arona wasn't entirely wrong. Humans were new here, but that didn't mean they couldn't earn their place. As they passed a series of interactive displays, Arona paused, examining one of the holographic terminals that showed a rotating schematic of a human-designed shielding system. She tapped a clawed finger on the interface, bringing up detailed specs. Luke noted how quickly she scanned through the data, her bright eyes absorbing the information at a speed that made him feel like a child with a puzzle book. Your shields are rudimentary, she remarked. Effective but basic. I'd have expected more ingenuity. Well, we built them to be practical, Luke said, stepping up beside her. And they work. Isn't that what matters? For now, perhaps. Arona turned to face him again. But I'm more interested in what you're capable of when pushed. How you handle a challenge, a crisis. Funny, Luke said, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. Most people prefer smooth operations, not crises. Most people aren't Zarin. She left it at that and moved on, leaving Luke to wonder what he had just gotten himself into. Arona wasn't used to waiting. As she watched the human technician scramble around the station's shielding array, her patience began to wear thin. The array's control module was open, wires and conduits exposed. Luke was inside, his arms nearly elbow-deep in a tangled mess of human engineering. Does it always take you this long? She asked, her tone light but edged with challenge. Luke poked his head out from behind the panel. You can't rush quality, he said, though his expression revealed just a trace of irritation. And if you're going to keep hovering, at least hand me the diagnostic scanner. Arona raised an eyebrow. You presume I know which one that is. It's the one on top of that toolkit, Luke replied, gesturing toward a box filled with an assortment of devices. She approached the kit, studied the unfamiliar tools for a moment, then grabbed the scanner and passed it to him. "Here." "Thanks," Luke muttered, shifting back into the cramped space. He pressed a series of buttons on the scanner, and the device began to hum faintly. A moment later, a holographic display projected into the air, showing a web of red warning indicators. "Well, that's not good. Is it ever?" Arona quipped, leaning against the wall and crossing her arms. "Do you know what's causing it?" "Looks like a power fluctuation," Luke said. "Probably a surge in the conduit upstream. We'll need to reroute it, but I'm going to need a second pair of hands to hold the bypass in place while I reprogram the array." "And you want me to do it?" Arona sounded skeptical. "You do realize I'm not an engineer." "I don't need you to be an engineer. I just need you to hold something steady for 5 minutes. Can you do that?" Arona considered him for a moment. Despite his laid-back demeanor, she could sense the quiet intensity beneath it. She was used to people being intimidated by her, but Luke treated her like just another crew member. It was refreshing, if somewhat annoying. "Fine," she said. "Show me what to hold." Luke slid out from behind the panel and pointed to a small cylindrical module. "This bypass relay. Just keep it still while I run the diagnostics again. If it moves even a little, we'll have to start over." Arona picked up the relay and held it as instructed. It was deceptively light but thrummed faintly in her hands, as if it contained a barely contained spark of energy. She kept her grip firm, watching as Luke dove back into the panel and began typing on a small interface. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked after a moment of silence. "Fixing stuff." Luke didn't look up. "Since I was old enough to take apart a toaster. Worked my way through different repair jobs before they brought me out here. And now you're working on humanity's most advanced station." "Something like that." Arona tilted her head, observing him. "You seem pretty comfortable here. Do you enjoy it?" "I enjoy solving problems," Luke replied. "Every time something breaks, it's like a puzzle. I like figuring out how all the pieces fit together." "Interesting," Arona said. "The Zarin value that kind of thinking." "I'm guessing the Zarin value anything that's not boring," Luke said with a faint smile. Arona laughed, a short, melodic sound. "You're not wrong, though I'm not sure your shields qualify as exciting." "They'll get the job done," Luke said. "And if I can get this relay set, they'll get the job done a lot better." Arona glanced down at the bypass in her hands. "If you need me to hold something else, just let me know. I'll keep that in mind." Luke worked quickly, tapping commands into the interface while occasionally glancing at the scanner's holographic display. After a few more minutes of adjustments, the red warning indicators turned green, and the faint hum of the shielding array stabilized. "Got it?" Luke said, leaning back and letting out a small sigh of relief. "You can let go now." Arona handed the bypass back to him and crossed her arms again. "That wasn't too bad. See? Told you it wouldn't be." She smirked. "I still think you humans have a long way to go, but maybe you're not as clueless as I thought." "I'll take that as a compliment," Luke said, closing the panel and picking up his toolkit. "But if you really want to be impressed, stick around. This station's full of surprises." "I'll hold you to that," Arona said. "And if you're not as clever as you claim, I'll find out soon enough." The two of them left the array chamber, Arona trailing just behind Luke as they headed back toward the central hub. She watched him as they walked, intrigued despite herself. This human was turning out to be more interesting than she'd anticipated, and she was looking forward to what came next. Luke ducked under the low-maintenance hatch, Arona close behind him. They had been working together for just a few hours, and already the station's environmental systems were throwing them another curveball. The low-grade tremor that had rattled the station earlier seemed harmless enough at first, but now it was causing random power surges all over the facility. Luke ran a hand through his hair, staring at the control console's flickering screen. "This thing's fried," he muttered, crouching down to pry open the panel. "Surge must have hit it harder than I thought. And this is supposed to be cutting-edge human technology?" Arona's voice came from behind him, a little too smug for his liking. She leaned casually against the wall, her golden Zarin coat reflecting faintly in the dim lighting. Luke shot her a look over his shoulder. "You're welcome to take over any time, genius." "Tempting," Arona said, "but I'd rather see how you handle it. Consider it an evaluation." "Well, the evaluation might end with us both freezing our tails off if we can't stabilize the temperature regulators," Luke said. He grabbed a multi-tool from his kit and started working on the tangled mess of wiring behind the console. "The whole system is acting like it's got a mind of its own." Arona moved closer, crouching down to his level. "What exactly are you doing?" "Bypassing the damaged circuits. If I can reroute the current through the secondary grid, we should be able to keep the regulators online until I can install a proper replacement module." Arona said thoughtfully. "Sounds almost competent." "Almost? Gee, thanks." She tilted her head, watching him. "You could use another pair of hands." Luke paused and glanced up at her, surprised. "You offering to help?" Arona shrugged. "I can follow instructions." "All right," Luke said. "Hold this lead here. Keep it steady while I switch the connections." She complied, gripping the wire as he worked quickly to reattach a couple of frayed ends. "You know," Arona said after a moment, "most of the humans I've met here so far aren't as flexible. They seem very by the book. Not a lot of quick thinking." "That's what happens when you run everything by committees," Luke said. "But not everyone works that way. Some of us are used to improvising." Arona studied him for a moment. "Improvisation is a trait my people admire. Perhaps I underestimated you." Luke's hands paused briefly, then resumed their work. "I'll take that as a compliment." "I suppose it was." The console let out a series of soft beeps, and the flickering screen stabilized. Luke grinned, tapping a few keys. "Looks like that did it. Temperature control should hold now." "Impressive," Arona said, straightening up as Luke packed his tools. "You handled that well. Teamwork makes the dream work," Luke quipped. Arona gave him a puzzled look. "What does that mean?" "It's just a saying," he said with a chuckle. "Never mind." They started walking back down the corridor, the faint hum of the station's systems more steady now. Arona glanced at him sideways. "You're different from what I expected." "How so?" Luke asked, slinging his toolkit over his shoulder. "You're not trying to impress me. Not in the way most people do, at least. You're just doing your job." Luke shrugged. "What good is trying to impress someone if you can't actually back it up? I figure, just get the work done, and the rest follows." "A pragmatic approach," Arona said, her tone more serious now. "And an effective one, it seems." Luke stopped at a junction and looked at her. "You don't seem like the type who's easily impressed." "What are you really doing here, Arona?" Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. "I wanted to see what humanity was capable of, and I wanted to test myself. Your species is new to the stars. I was curious if you had what it takes to last out here. And, she said with a small enigmatic smile, "I'm still deciding." Luke smirked. "Well, I'll try not to disappoint." "You've done a decent job so far," Arona admitted. They continued walking, their pace unhurried. The station's lights flickered slightly, but the immediate crisis was over. For now, at least, they had found a rhythm. Two very different beings working together, learning to trust each other. Luke didn't know what the next challenge would be, but he was starting to think he didn't mind having Arona at his side when it came. Luke adjusted his collar, glancing at the holographic signs lining the corridor. The Zarin cultural exhibit was held in a spacious dome on the station's upper level, and Arona had insisted he attend. As he neared the entrance, he spotted her waiting by a gleaming display case, arms folded and tail twitching slightly. "You're late," Arona said, her tone light but with that characteristic edge of hers. "Actually, I'm right on time," Luke replied, giving her a small grin. "I just like making an entrance." Arona raised a brow, then gestured to the hall beyond. "Well, since you've arrived, I suppose I'll have to show you around. Try to keep up. The exhibit was a collection of holograms, artifacts, and performances highlighting Zarin traditions. One display showed an intricate dance, the performers moving in a complex rhythm that seemed to tell a story. Another featured a series of ceremonial weapons, their surfaces engraved with swirling patterns. This is one of our challenge weapons, Arona said, stopping in front of a curved blade suspended in a field of light. When two Zarin dispute leadership, they often settle it in a duel. Of course, these days it's mostly ceremonial. Luke leaned closer to inspect the weapon. Looks like it could still do some damage. It could, Arona said, a hint of pride in her voice. But the real challenge isn't in the fight. It's in the strategy. The weapon's design forces you to think ahead, anticipate your opponent's moves. Luke straightened up. So, it's like a physical version of a chess match. Arona tilted her head. Chess? I've heard of it, but I've never played. Is it similar? It's a human game, Luke explained. A battle of wits. No physical fighting, just moving pieces around a board to outthink your opponent. Interesting, Arona said. Perhaps you'll teach me sometime. Sure, Luke replied, but you'd better be prepared. I'm not going to let you win just because you're a galactic ambassador. Arona laughed softly. I wouldn't want it any other way. They moved on to another section of the exhibit, where holograms displayed Zarin architecture. The structures were elegant and functional, often built into natural formations rather than overtaking them. Luke found himself impressed by their blending of form and function. This is one of our oldest designs, Arona said, gesturing toward a massive holographic archway that seemed to shimmer. It was built into the cliffs of Harunesh, a sacred place for my people. Every year, we hold a festival there to honor our ancestors and seek guidance for the challenges ahead. You really do like your challenges, Luke said. Life is a challenge, Arona replied, her tone matter-of-fact, and facing it head-on is how we grow. Luke nodded, considering her words. Humans aren't so different in that way. We might not duel over leadership, but we're always looking for ways to push ourselves. Whether it's through science, art, or exploration. Arona turned to him, her gaze searching. And yet, you still have so much to learn about the galaxy. So many species are wary of humanity's presence. Yet you approach it all with curiosity rather than caution. Is that a bad thing? Luke asked, meeting her eyes. Not necessarily, she said. It's unexpected, and perhaps refreshing. Luke allowed himself a small smile. I'll take that as a compliment. They continued their tour, eventually ending up in a quieter section of the exhibit where Zarin music filled the air. The melodies were haunting and complex, with layered harmonics that seemed to resonate in his chest. Luke closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over him. It's beautiful, he said softly. What's the song about? It's a hymn to the stars, Arona said. A reminder of where we came from, and where we might go. I'd like to hear more of this, Luke said. Do you have recordings? I'll send you some, Arona said. But it's best experienced live. I'll keep that in mind, Luke replied. He glanced at her, noticing a more relaxed expression on her face. I'm glad you invited me here. It's not every day I get to see something like this. Consider it a fair exchange, Arona said. Next time, you can show me something uniquely human. I've got a few ideas, Luke said, thinking of the guitar he'd stashed in his quarters. You might even be impressed. Bold claim, Arona said with a faint smile. But I look forward to it. They stood there for a while longer, listening to the music, their earlier banter replaced by a quiet understanding. For the first time, Luke felt like he wasn't just working with Arona, he was beginning to know her, and that, he realized, might be the biggest challenge of all. Luke adjusted the strap on his tool bag as he entered the repair bay, finding Arona already there, seated cross-legged on one of the large maintenance consoles. She wasn't in her usual formal attire. Instead, she wore a simple Zarin work uniform, which surprised him. It made her seem more approachable, or at least as approachable as someone like Arona could be. Early for once, Luke remarked, placing his bag on a nearby surface and flipping it open. I had nothing else to do, Arona replied, though her tone was less sharp than usual. Besides, I wanted to see how you'd handle today's challenge. Luke gave her a look. Is everything a challenge to you? Not everything, she said, leaning back on her hands. Just the interesting parts. Well, this is going to be more boring maintenance, Luke warned. Some of the station's power couplings need recalibration. It's mostly routine work. Arona tilted her head. You call it boring, but you wouldn't do it if it weren't important. Luke shrugged. Routine or not, it's got to be done. The station's not going to run itself. He pulled out a diagnostic scanner and started running a check on the nearest power relay. Arona hopped down from her perch and walked over, observing him quietly for a moment. What are you looking for? She asked. Voltage irregularities, Luke explained. If the readings are off, it could mean a damaged capacitor or a misaligned connection. Either one would cause issues if left unchecked. Arona leaned closer, watching the scanner's display. And how do you fix it? Depends on what the problem is. Luke glanced at her, surprised by her interest. You're really curious about this, huh? Call it a passing interest, she sighed. That's a good way to look at it, Arona said thoughtfully. Preventing the problem rather than reacting to it. Exactly. Luke nodded, his hands still busy with the scanner. Kind of like what you said about strategy the other day. It's all about thinking ahead. Arona regarded him for a moment, then smiled slightly. I suppose it is. They continued working side by side, Luke explaining his process while Arona occasionally offered her own insights or asked questions. As they moved from one power coupling to the next, the conversation began to drift into more personal territory. So, Arona said as Luke tightened a loose connector, what brought you out here in the first place? Luke glanced at her. You mean the station? Yes, you could have stayed on Earth, taken a simpler job. But you came out here instead. Why? Luke thought for a moment. I guess I wanted to be part of something new. Humanity's just starting to reach out into the galaxy. It's exciting. And yeah, it's a little daunting, but that's what makes it worth doing. Arona nodded. You wanted a challenge. Luke laughed. I guess you could put it that way. They moved on to another relay. This one was more stubborn, its readings fluctuating even after Luke adjusted the connections. He frowned and pulled out a different tool, muttering to himself as he worked. Need any help? Arona offered, surprising him. Sure, he said, handing her a stabilizer rod. Hold this steady while I reset the circuit. Arona held the rod in place, watching as Luke carefully reconnected the wires. They were close now, their shoulders nearly touching. Luke felt the faint heat radiating from her and caught a whiff of a scent he couldn't quite place. Sharp, but not unpleasant. Almost got it, Luke said, his voice a little quieter. He tightened one last bolt, and the relay's readings stabilized. There, good as new. Not bad, Arona said, handing the stabilizer rod back to him. Luke turned to look at her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Arona's usual guarded expression had softened, and Luke realized just how striking her features were. The tension of the moment, the quiet hum of the station around them, made the air feel heavier. Thanks for helping out, Luke said finally, breaking the silence. You're welcome, Arona replied. Her tone was calm, but her gaze lingered on him a moment longer before she stepped back. As they packed up their tools, Luke found himself glancing at her now and then. She wasn't just a visiting dignitary anymore, not to him. She was Arona, someone who challenged him, intrigued him, and he had to admit, someone he wanted to know better. Same time tomorrow? He asked, slinging his bag over his shoulder. Arona gave him a small, enigmatic smile. If you can keep up. Luke leaned against the console, taking a deep breath as he surveyed the mess of wires and blinking lights before him. The Zarin artifact sat on the workbench, pulsing faintly with a rhythm that wasn't supposed to be there. Next to it, Arona stood with her arms crossed, her expression an unsettling mix of curiosity and mild frustration. You're sure you know what you're doing? She asked, her golden eyes narrowing slightly. Nope, Luke replied without looking up. But that's never stopped me before. Arona raised an eyebrow. Comforting. I aim to please. Luke tapped a series of keys on the control pad. A thin stream of holographic data flowed up from the artifact, shimmering in the dim light. This thing's tech is not straightforward. I'm guessing it's using some kind of self-regulating power loop, but it's out of sync. Arona moved closer, her brow furrowed. How would it have fallen out of sync? The calibration is designed to remain stable for decades. I don't know, Luke admitted, glancing at her. It could be a surge from the station's grid, or maybe someone tinkered with it before I got here. Either way, if we don't get it back in sync, it's going to blow out half the research lab. She frowned. What do you need from me? Hold this probe, Luke said, passing her a slender, wand-like device. When I tell you, touch it to the top node. That should stabilize the power flow while I recalibrate the loop. Arona took the probe, examining it briefly. You're not worried I might overload it? Nope. I trust you, Luke said, and then he paused. Wait. Are you saying you might overload it? I'm saying I've never used one of these, Arona replied, her tone teasing. Luke let out a dry chuckle. Well, there's a first time for everything. You ready? She nodded, stepping closer to the artifact. Just tell me when. Okay. Here goes, Luke said, his fingers dancing over the controls. The pulsing light grew brighter, and the humming sound from the artifact deepened. Now, gently touch the top node. Arona complied, pressing the probe against the designated point. Instantly, the pulsing steadied, and Luke grinned. That's it. Hold it steady while I... The artifact let out a sharp crackle, and the room filled with a bright flash. Arona flinched but didn't let go of the probe. Luke swore under his breath, quickly adjusting the settings. What was that? She asked, her voice steady despite the sparks flying around them. Power spike, Luke said. Almost there. Just keep holding. Okay, now remove the probe. Slowly. Arona lifted the probe away, and the artifact's light dimmed, settling into a soft, steady glow. The hum faded, leaving the room quiet again. Luke let out a long breath, leaning against the console. Well, that was exciting, he said, looking over at her. Exciting? Arona asked, arching a brow. I nearly got fried. But you didn't, Luke pointed out. And now it's fixed. We make a pretty good team. Arona tilted her head, studying him. You're not afraid of taking risks, are you? Luke shrugged. Not when they're calculated. And not when I've got a partner who can handle them. Her expression softened, and for the first time, Luke thought he saw genuine appreciation in her eyes. You handled that well, she said. I admit, I didn't expect you to pull it off. Well, you know me, Luke said with a lopsided grin. Always full of surprises. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The tension from the repair slowly ebbed away, replaced by something quieter, something that neither of them seemed to want to put into words. So, Luke said finally, breaking the silence. Does this mean I passed your little test? Arona smirked. Perhaps, but don't let it go to your head. Wouldn't dream of it. They began cleaning up the tools and shutting down the equipment, their movements synchronized after hours of working side by side. As Luke reached for the last set of diagnostic tools, his hand brushed against hers. He paused, glancing up. Arona didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at him, her sharp confidence momentarily replaced by something softer. Without thinking, Luke said, Hey, Before he could finish, Arona leaned in, her gaze steady. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow, leaving only the two of them standing in the quiet hum of the lab. Her hand moved to his, fingers brushing lightly against his palm. I think, Arona said softly, you've passed more than just a test today. Luke felt his face heat up, but he managed to nod. Well, thanks. She laughed, a low, musical sound. You're not very good at taking compliments, are you? Not when they come from someone like you, Luke admitted, his voice low. Her hand lingered for a moment before she pulled back. Perhaps you'll get used to it. I wouldn't mind trying. Their eyes met again, and this time, neither looked away. Hold still, Luke muttered. Crouched beneath a terminal console with a wiry tool in hand, he was squinting at a row of flickering lights that should have been steady. I'm not even moving, Arona replied. Her voice carried that familiar blend of sarcasm and amusement that Luke had started to enjoy. She stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him work. I mean the station, Luke clarified. Not you. Ah, Arona smirked. In that case, I'll allow it. Luke sighed, reaching up to adjust a circuit board. Sometimes I think you just like seeing me struggle. Sometimes, Arona teased. Luke, you give me far too much credit. It's more than sometimes. He glanced back at her, shaking his head. You know, for an alien ambassador, you've got a pretty sharp sense of humor. And you're surprisingly quick with a retort for a human engineer, she said. Then, after a pause, she added, one of many reasons I find you interesting. Interesting, huh? Luke muttered, sliding the circuit board into place. The console lights stabilized, and he flipped his tool closed. That almost sounded like a compliment. Don't let it go to your head, Arona said, though her tone softened. I don't offer those freely. Luke pushed himself to his feet, wiping his hands on his work pants. Guess I should feel honored, then. She tilted her head, watching him. Perhaps. Their banter had grown natural over the past few days, like a pattern they both knew by heart. But it was more than just banter. Luke had started to notice the way Arona lingered after a task was done. The way her questions turned from sharp and probing to genuinely curious. He couldn't quite figure her out, and that intrigued him. So, Luke said, resting a hand on the console's edge, what do we tackle next? Arona tapped her clawed fingers against her arm, looking thoughtful. There's a malfunctioning data relay in the comms bay. It's been causing interruptions across multiple frequencies. Sounds fun, Luke said dryly. Lead the way. They walked down the corridor side by side. The station's soft hum surrounded them, and for once, the place felt calm. It gave them a rare chance to talk without the pressure of a looming technical failure. Do you ever think about leaving the station? Arona asked suddenly, her voice quieter than usual. Luke glanced at her. Leaving? You mean for good? She nodded. You're competent enough to be stationed on a frontier outpost or even a colony world. Why stay here? Luke shrugged. I like it here. It's a good mix of challenges, no offense, and routine. I don't feel the need to be a pioneer. I'm more comfortable solving problems than exploring new worlds. Interesting, she said. Many Zarin would find that unusual. Well, humans are a mixed bag, Luke replied. Some of us crave the frontier, the unknown. Others, we're happy making things work where we are. They turned a corner, and Arona glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. You prefer stability. Luke smiled faintly. I wouldn't call working with you stable. But yeah, I guess I do. Her lips curved into a small, rare smile. I'll take that as a compliment. They reached the comms bay, and Luke set to work immediately. The relay was nestled behind a panel that had to be pried open with a hydraulic clamp. Arona helped hold the clamp steady as Luke dislodged the heavy cover. Careful, Luke said. This thing's sensitive. If we short it out, it'll take hours to recalibrate. Then don't short it out, Arona said simply. Luke gave her a look. Not planning on it, thanks. As he worked, Arona handed him tools and occasionally asked questions about the relay's function. Their usual back and forth continued, but there was a more relaxed rhythm to it now. Luke realized he wasn't just teaching her about human technology, he was starting to trust her input, too. She noticed things he might overlook, pointed out details he hadn't considered. Together, they made the repairs faster than he expected. When the relay's indicator lights turned green, Luke sat back on his heels, grinning. There we go. Fixed. Arona stepped back, brushing her hands off. You do good work. Luke glanced up at her. That sounded dangerously close to another compliment. Don't let it go to your head, she said. but the corners of her mouth quirked upward. Luke stood, gathering his tools. So, what's next on the list? Next? Arona said, her gaze lingering on him. I think we've done enough for today. He raised an eyebrow. You're letting me off the hook early? Call it a rare act of mercy, she said, her tone light. Then, with a quieter voice, she added, You've earned it. Luke found himself smiling. As they walked back toward the central hub, he couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them. It wasn't just the teamwork, the successful repairs, or even the banter. It was trust, mutual and growing. The distant hum of the station's core reverberated faintly through the engineering bay. Luke adjusted a terminal, scanning for any anomalies. Arona stood beside him, watching silently. She had asked to accompany him once again. Less because she needed to and more because, over the weeks, their partnership had become something neither of them openly acknowledged but both enjoyed. Everything checks out, Luke said, straightening. No power surges, no faulty relays. Looks like we might actually get a quiet shift for once. I doubt that, Arona replied, a faint smile playing on her lips. Something always goes wrong. True, Luke said, rubbing the back of his neck. And when it does, I'll be here to fix it. You seem comfortable with that, she said, her tone more thoughtful than teasing. You handle the unexpected better than most I've seen. He glanced at her, his hands still on the console. You're not bad at it yourself. You just like to pretend you're always in control. Arona raised an eyebrow. And you don't. Not really, Luke said with a shrug. I just roll with whatever happens. You say that, but I've seen the way you work. You don't just roll with it. You plan, adjust, and find a solution before things get out of hand. Her voice softened slightly. It's one of the reasons I respect you. Luke blinked, caught off guard. Respect me, huh? You must be feeling generous today. Arona's smile widened just enough to show her fangs. Don't get used to it. They shared a quiet chuckle. The tension that had once marked their conversations now replaced with a comfortable ease. Luke turned back to the terminal, making a final note in the system log. Arona watched him for a moment longer before speaking again. You said humans always adapt, she said. Do you think you've adapted to me? Luke paused, the question hanging in the air. He looked at her, meeting her golden eyes. I think we've both adapted to each other, he said after a moment. Perhaps. Arona stepped closer, her expression unreadable. But there's still more to learn, isn't there? Luke tilted his head. More to learn about what? About us, Arona said simply. How we work together. What we can accomplish. That almost sounds like a challenge, Luke said, his voice lighter now. It might be, she replied. Her voice softened again. You seem to enjoy those. Luke studied her face, noting the subtle shift in her demeanor. Arona, why are you really here? I mean, I know the official reason. But what brought you to this station in the first place? For once, she didn't deflect. Instead, she took a breath before answering. I wanted to see what humans were capable of. Not just as individuals, but as a species. To understand if your ingenuity was more than a fluke. Luke nodded slowly. And you've proven interesting, Arona said, her gaze steady. You're not what I expected. Thanks, Luke said with a small grin. I think. She stepped closer still, standing just a few inches away. I wasn't looking for what I found here, but I'm not sure I want to leave it behind. Luke felt his heart beat a little faster. You don't have to. They stood there, the hum of the station fading into the background. Arona reached out, her hand brushing against his. Luke didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand slightly, their fingers meeting. I've never met anyone like you, Arona said quietly. Human or otherwise. Same here, Luke replied, his voice low. They stayed that way for a moment longer, their hands lightly touching. Then Arona leaned in, closing the small gap between them. Her movement was slow, deliberate, giving Luke the chance to step back. But he didn't. Instead, he met her halfway, and their lips brushed in a tentative, gentle kiss. When they pulled back, Arona's eyes searched his face. "I told you I was looking for a challenge," she said softly. "But I didn't expect it to be this." Luke smiled faintly, his hand still in hers. "Neither did I." As they stood there, the station's hum returning to their awareness, it was clear they'd crossed a threshold. They were no longer just colleagues navigating the unknown. They were something more, something that neither of them had planned, but both were willing to explore. Aufgeben.